The Smoky Mountain Massacre of 1900. Trentham clan butchered 22 timber barons who cut their forest. The bloodiest act of vengeance in Smoky Mountain history and the most devastating campaign of retribution the Southern Highlands had ever witnessed from a clan whose forest was their cathedral, their pharmacy, their livelihood, and the very breath of their existence. This is the true story of the Trentham clan. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Sevier County, Tennessee, in the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains, known throughout the region as one of the most ancient and biologically diverse forests on the North American continent. The mountains rise here in wave after wave of blue-green ridgeline, their slopes clothed in timber so old and so vast that the first European settlers who encountered them believed they had stumbled upon the original Garden of Eden. These were not merely forests but ecosystems of staggering complexity, cathedrals of tulip, poplar and chestnut and hemlock, whose canopies blocked the sun and whose roots held the mountains together, whose existence predated human memory, and whose destruction would constitute a crime against the earth itself. You see, in the Great Smoky Mountains at the turn of the 20th century, the relationship between mountain families and the forests that surrounded them was not one of simple habitation but of profound interdependence. The forest provided everything: food in the form of game and mast and wild plants, medicine in the form of roots and bark and herbs that could treat any ailment the mountain world produced, building material for cabins and barns and fences, fuel for the fires that sustained life through winters so cold that streams froze solid and breath crystallized in the air. To destroy the forest was to destroy the people who lived within it, to strip from them not merely their livelihood, but their identity, their history, their connection to ancestors who had lived beneath the same canopy for generations. The timber industry had been expanding throughout the southern Appalachians for decades by the time our story begins, driven by the insatiable demand for lumber that the nation's growth required. The cities of the East and the railroads of the West consumed wood at a rate that exhausted one forest after another, sending the timber companies ever deeper into the mountains in search of virgin stands that had never known the axe. By 1900, the companies had reached the Great Smokies, the last great wilderness forest in the eastern United States, and they came with an appetite that would consume everything in their path. The family who would become known throughout the Smokies simply as the Trentham clan had lived in the shadow of Mount LeConte for 5 generations, since Angus Trentham had followed an elk trail through Sugarland's Gap and discovered a hollow so perfectly situated that he claimed it on the spot and never left. Angus had been a forester before the word existed, a man who understood the relationship between trees and water and soil with an intuition that modern science would spend a century trying to replicate. He had chosen his land not for its timber value but for its wholeness, recognizing in the old-growth forest that surrounded it a living system whose health was inseparable from his own. That's right. The Trenthams had lived within their forest rather than upon it, had taken what they needed and left what they did not, had maintained a relationship with the land that the timber companies could not comprehend, and that the modern world would eventually learn to call conservation. Their forest was not a commodity, but a partner, not a resource to be extracted, but a community to be sustained. Each generation had added to the understanding that the previous generation had accumulated, building a body of knowledge about the forest and its workings that rivaled anything the universities would produce in the century to come. By the time of the events of our story, the clan patriarch was a man named Ezekiel Trentham, 61 years old, the 5th generation of his family to steward the forest that Angus had claimed. Ezekiel was a man whose physical appearance reflected the mountain that had shaped him. Tall and weathered, his face seamed by wind and sun, his hands calloused by decades of labor, his eyes carrying the watchful quality of a man who had spent his life observing the subtle signs by which the forest communicated its condition. He could read the land the way educated men read books, could predict weather by the behavior of birds and the color of sunset, could diagnose the health of a watershed by examining the creatures that lived in its streams. Ezekiel's wife, Sarah, was a woman whose knowledge of forest plants was legendary throughout the region. She was the community's healer, a woman who could treat everything from snakebite to pneumonia, using preparations derived from the roots and bark and leaves of the forest that surrounded her home. Her pharmacopoeia was vast and sophisticated, built on generations of accumulated knowledge that had been passed from mother to daughter through the Trentham women, a body of healing wisdom that depended entirely on the continued existence of the forest from which its materials were drawn. The Trentham clan, at the time of our story, numbered 37 people living in 12 cabins scattered across the hollow and the surrounding ridges. Ezekiel and Sarah had 7 children, 6 sons and a daughter, all of whom had married and begun families of their own. The eldest son, Angus, named for the clan's founder, was 39 years old and served as his father's right hand in all matters relating to the forest. His brothers Josiah, Thomas, William, Luther, and Daniel ranged in age from 36 to 24, each one possessing specific knowledge and skills that contributed to the clan's stewardship of the land. The daughter, Martha, had married a man named Combs from the next hollow, but remained fiercely connected to her family and their forest. The forest that the Trenthams stewarded covered approximately 3,000 acres of mountainside, ranging from the creek bottoms at 2,000 feet to the spruce fir ridgeline at over 6,000. The diversity of the forest was extraordinary, containing more species of trees than all of Europe combined, a living library of biological wealth that had been accumulating since the last ice age. Tulip poplars that had been growing since before Columbus reached the Americas rose to heights of 150 feet, their trunks too wide for 3 men to encircle with their arms. American chestnuts, not yet touched by the blight that would later devastate them, produced mast that fed every creature in the forest, from bears to deer to the families who gathered the nuts each autumn. Hemlocks so ancient that their bases had become cathedrals of root and moss-sheltered pools, where native trout held in water so cold and clear that a man could count every pebble on the bottom. The trees were not merely old, they were ancient, some of them having been growing since before the English language existed, since before the great cathedrals of Europe were built, since before the nations that would eventually claim ownership of the continent had even been imagined. Each one represented centuries of growth, of sun and rain and patience, of roots that had slowly worked their way through rock to find the water that sustained them. To cut them was to destroy something that could not be replaced within any human time frame, to erase history that had been written in wood and bark and leaf over the course of a millennium. The streams that flowed through the Trentham forest were as vital as the trees themselves. Fed by springs that emerged from the mountain's core, they provided the water that every living thing in the hollow depended upon. The trout that lived in them were the descendants of fish that had inhabited these waters since the last ice age, populations that had survived because the forest that shaded them maintained the cold, clear conditions they required. Remove the trees, and the streams would warm, would silt, would become something other than what they had been for 10,000 years. Now, to understand what happened in the spring of 1900, you need to understand the particular circumstances that had brought the timber industry to the Trentham forest. The Great Eastern Lumber Company had been acquiring timber rights throughout the Smokies, purchasing them from absentee landowners, from families pressured into selling, from state agencies that treated the forest as a revenue source rather than a living system. The company was led by a man named Vernon Crawford, a timber baron from Philadelphia, whose fortune had been built by cutting forests from Maine to Georgia, and who viewed the Smokies as the greatest prize remaining in the eastern timber market. Crawford had assembled a team of 22 men to manage the Smoky Mountain operation, surveyors, foremen, mill operators, and the political fixers who ensured that local officials looked the other way when the cutting began. These men were experienced in the timber trade, veterans of operations that had stripped forests from the Adirondacks to the Blue Ridge, men who viewed trees as dollar signs and measured success in board feet rather than ecosystem health. The company had acquired timber rights to the Trentham forest through a combination of fraud and political manipulation. The original deed that Angus Trentham had secured protected the family's rights to the land itself, but was ambiguous about the timber rights, an ambiguity that the company's lawyers exploited to secure a court ruling granting them the right to cut. Ezekiel had fought the ruling through every legal channel available, had hired lawyers he could not afford, had petitioned politicians who listened politely and did nothing. The courts sided with the company, as courts throughout Appalachia had sided with corporate interests for decades, and the Trenthams were informed that the cutting would begin in April of 1900. And that's when the nightmare began to unfold. You see, the morning the Sawyers arrived was a morning that the oldest members of the Trentham clan would remember as the beginning of the end of the world they had known. A crew of over 100 men, hired from outside the region and equipped with cross-cut saws and axes and the newly developed steam-powered machinery that could fell a tree in minutes that would have taken a team of sawyers hours, arrived in the hollow with the legal authority to cut every tree on 3,000 acres of the oldest forest in eastern America. The sound of the first tree falling was a sound that Ezekiel Trentham would carry to his grave, a crack that echoed across the hollow like a gunshot, followed by a rushing roar as the crown broke through the canopy and the trunk struck the earth with an impact that shook the ground beneath his feet. The tree was a tulip poplar that had been growing on the lower slope for over 400 years, a tree that Ezekiel's great-great-grandfather Angus had admired when he first entered the hollow, a tree that had been old when the first English settlers reached the shores of Virginia. It took the Sawyers less than 10 minutes to bring it down. 400 years of growth, of reaching toward the sun, of providing shade and shelter and mast for generations of creatures, both human and animal, ended in the time it takes to eat a sandwich. The tree hit the ground and bounced, its massive trunk rebounding from the forest floor with a force that broke smaller trees in its path, its crown tangling with the canopy of its neighbors in a chaos of snapping branches and falling debris. And then the Sawyers moved to the next tree and the next and the next. The cutting continued for weeks, the crews working from dawn to dusk, the sound of saws and axes filling the hollow from first light to last, the crash of falling trees so constant that it became a kind of horrible music, a drumbeat of destruction that marked the passage of hours and days and weeks. The Trentham clan watched in helpless horror as the forest that had sustained them for 5 generations was systematically destroyed, each tree falling, taking with it not merely timber, but history, medicine, shelter, and the spiritual connection that had defined their relationship with the land. The Sawyers worked without sentiment, attacking each tree with the efficient brutality of men who had done this work their entire lives and who measured their success by the number of trunks they could bring down in a day. They did not see beauty in the ancient hemlocks, whose trunks required 2 men standing side by side to pull a crosscut saw through their heartwood. They did not see history in the chestnuts whose branches had been dropping mast since before the Mayflower sailed. They saw board feet and pay slips and the cold arithmetic of an industry that consumed forests the way fire consumed paper. The steam-powered skidders arrived after the Sawyers had done their work, massive machines that dragged the felled trunks across the forest floor with a force that destroyed everything in their path. The skid trails gouged channels in the earth 6 feet deep, exposing the mineral soil that had been protected by millennia of leaf fall and decay. The trails became gullies when it rained, the water carrying tons of topsoil into streams that had been clear for 10,000 years. The splash dams came next, temporary structures built across the streams to create reservoirs that would carry the logs downstream to the mills. When the dams were dynamited, the wall of water that surged through the stream bed scoured everything in its path, destroying the stream habitat that generations of trout had depended upon, rearranging the bed itself into a chaos of gravel and debris that bore no resemblance to the carefully structured pools and riffles that nature had created over millennia. The scale of the destruction was staggering. The crews cut everything, taking not merely the largest and most valuable trees, but the smaller ones as well, clearing the land so completely that nothing remained but stumps and slash and the naked, wounded earth. The understory plants that Sarah used for medicine were destroyed, trampled by oxen and buried under the debris of fallen giants. The streams that had run clear for 10,000 years turned brown with sediment, as the exposed soil washed into waterways that had been designed by nature to be protected by forest. The wildlife fled or died. The bears that had fed on the chestnut mast moved to higher ground, then moved again as the cutting followed them. The deer lost their browse and their shelter simultaneously. The trout died by the thousands as the streams warmed and silted, their ancient populations collapsing in days as conditions that had sustained them for millennia were destroyed in weeks. The Trenthams' protests were ignored. Ezekiel confronted Crawford directly. standing before the timber baron in the mud and slash of what had been a grove of 400-year-old chestnuts, and demanding that the cutting stop. Crawford laughed and told Ezekiel that the law was on his side, that the trees belonged to the company, that nothing the Trenthams could do would stop the operation. He called Ezekiel an ignorant mountaineer, told him that progress could not be resisted, that the forest would grow back in time, and that the money the timber generated would benefit everyone. The forest would not grow back in time. The old-growth ecosystem that had been developing for 10,000 years could not be replaced by a century of regrowth. The specific assemblage of species, the relationships between organisms that had evolved over millennia, the soil conditions that only ancient forests could produce, all of these were destroyed as completely as if the mountain itself had been removed. What would grow back would be a different forest, a simpler forest, a forest that lacked the complexity and diversity that had made the original irreplaceable. The cutting took 3 months to complete. By July of 1900, 3,000 acres of the oldest forest in eastern America had been reduced to stumps and slash and naked earth. The hollow that had been a cathedral of green was now a wasteland of mud and debris, the streams running brown, the wildlife gone, the medicinal plants destroyed. The Trentham clan's entire way of life obliterated as completely as if a fire had swept through and consumed everything. Sarah's reaction to the destruction of the forest was as devastating as the destruction itself. The woman whose entire healing practice depended on the plants that grew beneath the forest canopy watched in anguish as species she had relied upon for decades were trampled and buried and burned. Some of the plants she used were so specific to the old-growth environment that they could not survive in open sunlight, their existence dependent on the shade and soil conditions that only ancient forests provided. When the trees fell, these plants died too, and with them died generations of healing knowledge that could never be applied again. Martha, the daughter, watched the streams she had played in as a child turn brown and lifeless, the trout that had been swimming in those waters since the Ice Age suffocating in silt that the bare earth could no longer hold. She gathered her children and wept, not for herself, but for them, for the world they would inherit, a world stripped of everything that had given it beauty and meaning and life. The official channels of protest remained closed to the Trenthams throughout the cutting. Lawyers confirmed that the court ruling was final, that the timber rights had been legally transferred, that nothing in the law prohibited the complete destruction of a forest regardless of its age or ecological significance. Politicians expressed sympathy but offered no action, their campaigns funded by the same timber interests that were destroying the Trentham forest. But for Ezekiel Trentham and his clan, the matter had only begun. You see, the destruction of the forest had taken from the Trenthams everything that defined their existence, their food source, their medicine, their building material, their water supply, their spiritual connection to the land, and the accumulated knowledge of 5 generations of forest stewardship. But the destruction had not taken their anger, and it had not taken the skills that the mountain had spent generations teaching them. The family council that gathered in August of 1900, 1 month after the cutting ended, was the largest the clan had ever convened. All 37 members of the family were present, from Ezekiel and Sarah to the youngest grandchild. The meeting took place in the open air because the cabin that had traditionally hosted family gatherings had been damaged by a falling tree during the cutting, its roof partially collapsed, its porch crushed by a trunk that the sawyers had felled without regard for what lay in its path. Ezekiel stood before his family and spoke with a quiet intensity that those present would remember for the rest of their lives. He spoke of Angus, the founder, who had chosen this hollow because of its forest. He spoke of each generation that had followed, adding to the knowledge of the land, maintaining the balance that sustained everything. He spoke of the trees themselves, the tulip poplars and chestnuts and hemlocks that had been growing since before the Trenthams arrived, and that would never grow again. Not in any lifetime that mattered. He spoke of Sarah's plants, the medicine that the forest had provided and that the destruction had eliminated. He spoke of the streams and the trout and the bears and the birds, the entire web of life that had been torn apart in 3 months of cutting. And then he spoke of what would be done about it. They would kill them. Every one of the 22 men who had managed the operation that destroyed their forest, from Crawford himself to the foreman who had directed the cutting to the surveyors who had mapped it to the political fixers who had enabled it. Not the laborers, the common men who had been hired to swing axes and pull saws, men who were as much victims of the system as the Trenthams themselves, but the 22 men who had planned and profited from the destruction of a forest that had been growing for 10,000 years would pay with their lives. The decision was unanimous. Every adult member of the clan agreed, from the eldest son to the youngest cousin, understanding that what had been done to their forest demanded a response that the legal system would never provide. The clan had tried every legitimate avenue and been blocked at every turn. What remained was the mountain's own justice, older than any court and more absolute than any judge. And that decision, reached in a clearing that had been a grove of ancient chestnuts 3 months earlier, would set in motion a campaign of vengeance that would claim 22 lives and reshape the relationship between timber companies and mountain communities throughout the southern Appalachians. The planning process took 8 weeks, during which the Trentham clan appeared to be doing nothing more than trying to survive the aftermath of the cutting. The appearance was partly true. The destruction of the forest had created genuine hardship, eliminating food sources and medicine and building material that the family had depended upon for generations. But beneath the surface of survival, the clan was preparing for something that Crawford and his men could not have anticipated. The method they chose was as deliberate and meaningful as everything else about the Trentham campaign. Each of the 22 men would die by wood, killed by the very material they had spent their careers extracting from the forest. The specific methods would vary, but every death would involve timber in some form, the trees themselves becoming instruments of vengeance, the dead wood striking back at the men who had killed the living forest. Angus, the eldest son, coordinated the intelligence-gathering operation. His brothers fanned out across the region, tracking the movements of Crawford's 22 men, mapping their locations and habits, identifying the vulnerabilities that would allow the clan to reach each target. The mountain knowledge that had been used for 5 generations to navigate and steward the forest was now applied to the task of hunting the men who had destroyed it. Thomas handled the technical preparations, designing and constructing the devices and traps that would deliver the death sentences. William monitored the targets in the field, spending weeks in patient observation that drew on the same skills he had used to track game through the forest since childhood. Luther managed communications between the clan members, ensuring that everyone knew their role and their timing. Daniel, the youngest son, served as a courier, carrying messages through mountain trails that no outsider could navigate. The first killing came in October of 1900, 6 months after the cutting had begun and 2 months after the family council. The target was one of Crawford's surveyors, a man named James Tackett, who had mapped the Trentham forest for cutting, who had walked through the ancient trees and marked each one for the saw, reducing centuries of growth to data points on a map that told the sawyers where to cut. Tackett was found dead on a logging road, crushed beneath a massive log that appeared to have rolled from a timber stack as he passed. The log was a section of tulip poplar from the Trentham forest itself, one of the ancient trunks that had been felled during the cutting and stacked for transport to the mill. Its fall appeared accidental, the kind of logging accident that killed men in the timber industry every year, the inherent risk of working with materials that weighed thousands of pounds and could move with devastating force when improperly secured. The killing of James Tackett established the pattern that would define the entire campaign. Death by wood, death by the timber that the victim had helped to cut, the forest itself reaching out from beyond the grave to claim the men who had murdered it. The symbolism was unmistakable to anyone who understood what was happening, though the individual deaths appeared accidental to investigators who did not see the larger pattern. The second killing came 3 weeks later, targeting another of Crawford's men, a foreman who had supervised the cutting crews in the eastern section of the Trentham forest. This man, named Robert Lawson, was found dead in a sawmill, apparently killed when a board kicked back from the blade with enough force to impale him through the chest. The board was cut from Trentham timber, one of the ancient hemlocks that had shaded the streams where native trout had lived for 10,000 years. The third and fourth killings came in quick succession, each victim dying in circumstances that involved timber. The third man was crushed in a log drive when a jam released suddenly and caught him in a torrent of tumbling trunks. The fourth was found dead beneath a stack of lumber that had apparently collapsed without warning, the weight of thousands of board feet pressing the life from his body. That's right. The Trentham clan continued their campaign through the winter of 1900 and into the spring of 1901, striking with a regularity that reflected both their determination and their patience. The fifth man died when a tree he was felling, on a different operation far from the Smokies, kicked back and struck him with a force that the other sawyers said was impossible given the angle of the cut. The sixth was killed when a timber bridge collapsed beneath him, sending him and his horse into a ravine where the falling debris of wooden beams and planks battered him to death before the water could drown him. The seventh and eighth killings came before Christmas, each victim dying in timber-related circumstances that raised no suspicions individually, but that were beginning to form a pattern visible to those who knew what to look for. The seventh was crushed by a falling tree that had been standing dead for years and should not have fallen at that particular moment. The eighth was killed in a fire that started in a lumber dry house, the stacked timber burning with a ferocity that consumed the building and everyone in it in minutes. The ninth death came in January 1901, the 10th shortly after. By this point, nearly half of the 22 men were dead, each killed in circumstances involving wood or timber, each death appearing to be the kind of industrial accident that the logging profession produced with depressing regularity. Individually, no death raised suspicions. Collectively, they formed a pattern that someone attentive might have noticed. Crawford was among the first to sense that something was wrong. As a veteran of the timber industry, he understood the risks that his men faced, but even he could not explain why his Smoky Mountain team was dying at a rate that far exceeded anything coincidence could account for. He began to take precautions, warned his remaining men to be vigilant, hired additional security for the operations that were still running in the region. But the Trentham clan was not attacking the operations. They were attacking the men, individually and specifically, using methods that drew on their intimate knowledge of the forest and its materials to create death scenes that appeared accidental. Their understanding of wood, of how it moved and fell and burned and broke, knowledge accumulated over 5 generations of living within a forest and working with its products, made them uniquely qualified to construct killing scenarios that no investigator could distinguish from genuine accidents. The 11th killing targeted a man who had left the timber industry entirely, who had moved to Knoxville and taken a position in a bank, hoping that distance from the forest would protect him. He was found dead in his new home, killed when a structural beam collapsed and struck him as he walked beneath it. The beam was made of Smoky Mountain timber, installed during the home's construction, and its failure was attributed to a hidden defect in the wood that had weakened it over time. The 12th and 13th killings followed in quick succession, each death involving timber in some form. One man was killed by a falling tree branch during a windstorm, a branch so large that its impact was immediately fatal. Another died when the wooden floor of a warehouse collapsed beneath him, sending him 20 feet into a basement, where the debris of broken planks and beams finished what the fall had started. The 14th came in spring, the 15th shortly after. The surviving men were beginning to feel the weight of what was happening, the sense that death was following them through channels that they could not identify or defend against. Some became superstitious, believing that the forest itself was taking revenge, that the trees they had cut were reaching out from the grave to claim the men who had felled them. One of the surviving foremen, a man named Hensley who had overseen the cutting of the hemlock groves that sheltered the native trout streams, began to refuse entering any building constructed of wood. He slept outdoors when weather permitted, stayed in brick and stone structures when it did not, avoided lumber yards and sawmills, and even furniture made of natural wood. His precautions delayed his death by several weeks, but could not prevent it. He was killed in May, when a wooden bridge collapsed beneath his wagon as he crossed a stream, the same type of bridge that mountain communities had been building from timber for generations. The timbers that gave way had been weakened by cuts so precise that they were invisible to inspection, but that reduced the bridge's load capacity to a fraction of what it should have been. The 16th death came in summer, 1 year after the cutting had been completed, the anniversary timing deliberate, though no one but the clan understood its significance. This victim was one of the mill operators who had processed the Trentham timber, who had fed the ancient trunks into the saws that reduced centuries of growth to standardized planks. He was found dead in his own mill, caught in the machinery in a way that appeared to be the result of a moment's carelessness, but that the Trenthams had orchestrated through days of patient preparation. The 17th and 18th followed as autumn approached, each death maintaining the pattern of timber-related violence that had characterized the entire campaign. The 17th was crushed when a loaded timber wagon lost its brake on a mountain grade and ran him down, the logs it carried scattering across the road like the scattered bones of the forest that had produced them. The 18th was killed in a rockslide that brought down a hillside that had been destabilized by logging, the same kind of slope failure that the Trenthams had warned would result from cutting the trees that held the mountain together. The 19th and 20th killings came in quick succession, leaving only Crawford and one remaining associate alive from the original 22. The associate, a political fixer who had helped secure the court ruling that gave the company its timber rights, was found dead in his office when a bookshelf made of Smoky Mountain hardwood toppled and crushed him against his desk, the weight of the books and the shelving sufficient to kill a man twice his size. The 21st victim was Crawford's personal assistant, a man who had managed the logistical details of the Smoky Mountain operation, who had coordinated the crews and the equipment and the transportation of the timber to market. He was killed in a fire that consumed a lumber storage facility, the stacked timber burning with a heat so intense that it melted the metal fixtures of the building and reduced everything within to ash. And then there was only Crawford himself, the 22nd and final target, the man who had conceived the operation, who had acquired the timber rights through fraud and political manipulation, who had laughed at Ezekiel Trentham and called him an ignorant mountaineer, who had overseen the destruction of 3,000 acres of the oldest forest in eastern America. Crawford had taken every precaution available to him. He had retreated to his Philadelphia headquarters, had surrounded himself with security, had avoided anything made of wood with a paranoia that his associates found bewildering. He ate from metal plates, slept in a metal bed frame, refused to enter any building whose structural integrity he could not personally verify. He understood that something was hunting his men, even if he could not identify exactly what it was. But Crawford's headquarters was a building, and the building was a structure, and the structure contained wood. The floors were hardwood, the doors were oak, the staircase was mahogany. The very framework of the building was timber beneath its brick and stone exterior. Crawford could avoid the forest, but he could not avoid the forest's products, could not escape the material that had made his fortune and that now seemed determined to take his life. Crawford died on the 2nd anniversary of the first tree felled in the Trentham forest, 2 years to the day after a 400-year-old tulip poplar had fallen to the saws of men he had hired. He was found at the bottom of the mahogany staircase in his Philadelphia office, his neck broken in a fall that appeared to be caused by a structural failure in the staircase itself. The wooden banister had given way, the supports that held it had snapped, and Crawford had pitched forward and down with a force that killed him instantly. Investigation revealed that the staircase's failure was due to damage to the wooden supports that could not be attributed to any natural cause, cuts so precise and so well concealed that they were invisible to casual inspection, but that weakened the structure to the point of catastrophic failure. The investigator who discovered the cuts noted their precision with something approaching admiration, recognizing in their execution the work of someone who understood wood at a level that went beyond expertise into something approaching communion. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the killing stopped. The Trentham clan was never arrested, never tried, never officially connected to the deaths that had eliminated Vernon Crawford and 21 of his associates over the course of 2 years. The evidence that might have convicted them was never assembled into a coherent case. The deaths too widely scattered in time and location, the apparent causes too consistent with the genuine hazards of the timber industry for any investigator to prove deliberate human agency. But everyone knew. The mountain people knew some of the investigators suspected. The families of the dead men sensed the truth even if they could not prove it. They understood what had happened and why, understood that 22 men had paid with their lives for the crime of destroying a forest that had been growing for 10,000 years, understood that the Trentham clan had extracted a justice that the official system would never have provided. The clan lived for decades after the killings ended, remaining on the land that Angus Trentham had claimed, watching as the denuded mountainside slowly, painfully, began the process of regeneration. The forest that grew back was not the forest that had been destroyed, could never be the forest that had been destroyed. But it was forest nonetheless, the land's stubborn refusal to remain bare, the mountain's insistence on clothing itself in green, regardless of what men did to prevent it. Ezekiel lived to see the first saplings reach above his head, lived to see the bare earth covered again in green, lived to see the streams begin to clear as the new growth stabilized the soil. He died in the winter of 1922 at the age of 83, found one morning sitting against the stump of the tulip poplar that had been the first tree cut, the ancient stump still showing the saw marks that had ended 4 centuries of growth. He was buried on the ridge above the hollow in a grove of young tulip poplars that had seeded themselves from the roots of the ancients that had been destroyed. Sarah survived her husband by 3 years, dying in 1925 at the age of 80. She had spent her final decades attempting to rebuild her pharmacopoeia from the plants that returned as the forest regrew, discovering that some species came back quickly while others did not return at all, their specific requirements for shade and soil conditions no longer available in the young forest that was replacing the old. She died knowing that generations of healing knowledge had been lost along with the plants that had made it possible, a loss that could not be measured in board feet or dollars. The children continued on the land, each generation watching the forest grow back, with the patience that the mountain had taught them. They maintained the knowledge that their parents and grandparents had accumulated, applied it to the stewardship of the new forest, tried to guide its recovery toward the complexity and diversity that the original had possessed. The work was slow, and the progress was measured in decades rather than years, but the Trenthams were accustomed to thinking in generational time. The aftermath of the Trentham campaign reshaped the timber industry's approach to the Great Smoky Mountains. The exposure of what had been done to the Trentham forest, which emerged through investigation and journalism in the years that followed, generated public outrage that contributed to the growing conservation movement. The systematic destruction of old-growth forest, documented in photographs that showed the before and after with devastating clarity, became a symbol of everything that was wrong with unregulated timber extraction. Congressional hearings were convened to examine the practices of timber companies throughout the Appalachians. Witnesses testified about patterns of fraud and exploitation that extended far beyond Sevier County, documented instances of timber rights being acquired through deception and political manipulation, described the ecological devastation that followed when ancient forests were clear-cut without regard for the consequences. The hearings generated headlines that transformed public perception of the timber industry. Newspapers across the country published photographs of the Trentham Hollow, showing the stark contrast between the cathedral-like forest that had existed before the cutting and the wasteland that remained after. Editorials demanded accountability for the destruction, called for reforms that would protect the remaining old-growth forests, questioned the legal framework that allowed timber companies to destroy ecosystems that had been developing for millennia. The conservation movement that gained momentum from these revelations would eventually produce the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, established in 1934 to protect the remaining forests from the same destruction that had claimed the Trentham Hollow. The park's creation was driven in part by the horror that the Trentham case had inspired, the recognition that forests of such age and diversity and beauty could not be replaced and must be protected from the forces that would destroy them for short-term profit. The irony was not lost on the Trentham descendants that the park, which now protected the surrounding forest, had come too late to save theirs. The 3,000 acres that Angus Trentham had claimed and 5 generations had stewarded were inside the park boundaries, but the ancient trees that had made the hollow extraordinary were gone, replaced by second growth that, while beautiful, was a pale shadow of what had stood there before. The park protected what remained, but what remained was not what had been lost. The story of the Trentham forest became a cautionary tale in the early conservation movement, cited by advocates who argued that the destruction of old-growth forest was an irreversible act that no amount of regrowth could undo. Photographs of the denuded hollow, taken in 1901 by a journalist who had traveled to the Smokies to document the destruction, were reproduced in newspapers and magazines across the country. The images showed a landscape so thoroughly devastated that it resembled a battlefield, the stumps of ancient trees protruding from bare earth like grave markers in a cemetery that stretched for miles. The reforms that followed the campaign were significant, though they came too late for the Trentham forest. Regulations were established requiring environmental assessment before timber operations could proceed, limiting the scope and scale of cutting, protecting waterways and sensitive areas from the most destructive practices. These regulations were imperfect and often poorly enforced, but they represented a recognition that the unregulated destruction of ancient forests was a crime against the future that the law had a responsibility to prevent. The families of the dead men sought explanations that the system could not provide. Some learned for the first time the true scope of what their husbands and fathers had participated in, discovered that the operations they had managed had destroyed one of the most remarkable forests on the continent. The revelations created complicated grief, the mourning of individuals who had themselves been agents of destruction on a scale that was difficult to comprehend. The cultural impact extended beyond policy changes. The Trentham story became a legend throughout the Smoky Mountains, a reminder of what could happen when those who destroyed forests underestimated the families who lived within them. The story served as both warning and inspiration, cautioning timber companies against treating mountain people as obstacles to be removed while celebrating the determination of a clan that refused to accept the destruction of their world without response. The gravesite where Ezekiel and Sarah rest, on a ridge now shaded by trees that their grandchildren planted, became a place of pilgrimage for conservationists and mountain people who knew the story. The ridge offers a view of the hollow that was once a cathedral of old-growth forest, was then a wasteland of stumps and slash, and is now a second-growth forest that, while beautiful, lacks the complexity and grandeur of what was destroyed. The contrast between what is and what was is invisible to those who did not know the original forest, but the Trentham descendants can still point to the stumps of ancient trees and describe what once grew there. The songs that emerged from the Trentham story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, from the cutting through the campaign to the final killing. These songs mourned the forest as much as they celebrated the clan's vengeance, treating the ancient trees as characters in their own right, victims whose destruction demanded the same response as the murder of a human family member. The first songs appeared within months of the campaign's conclusion, composed by local musicians who understood the power of the narrative and the particular resonance it held for mountain communities whose forests were under similar threat. These early ballads spread through the Smokies and beyond, carried by the same oral tradition that had preserved the stories of earlier mountain conflicts. One popular ballad described the falling of the first tree, the 400-year-old tulip poplar that had stood since before Columbus, painting a vivid picture of its destruction in language that treated it as a murder rather than a logging operation. The song described the sound of the saw biting into wood that had been growing for 4 centuries, the groan of the trunk as it began to lean, the rush of air through the canopy as the crown descended, the impact that shook the earth and announced the beginning of the end. The melody was haunting and built on the oldest patterns of Appalachian music, drawn from the Scots-Irish traditions that the first settlers had brought across the ocean and that had been preserved in the mountains for generations. Musicians reported that audiences would weep during certain verses, that the description of the ancient trees falling produced an emotional response so powerful that some listeners had to leave the room. Another song told the story of the campaign, describing each timber-related death with a dark satisfaction that reflected the mountain community's approval of what the Trenthams had done. This song had an almost rhythmic quality, each verse building on the last, the deaths accumulating like the rings of a tree, each one adding to the total until the full count was reached. A third song focused on Sarah's loss, on the destruction of the medicinal plants that had sustained her healing practice, on the knowledge that died with the forest. This song was more mournful than the others, its melody carrying the weight of something irreplaceable lost, not merely plants and preparations, but centuries of accumulated wisdom that could never be recovered. A fourth song addressed Crawford directly, portraying the timber baron as a villain whose greed had destroyed something that money could never replace. This song described Crawford's death on the mahogany staircase with a satisfaction that bordered on joy, the timber that had made his fortune becoming the instrument of his punishment. Historians who have studied the Trentham case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an early example of environmental activism, arguing that the Trentham clan's defense of their forest anticipated the conservation movement by decades. They note that the clan's understanding of the forest as a living system, rather than a collection of timber resources, reflected ecological principles that mainstream science would not articulate for another half-century. Others have focused on the economic dimensions of the conflict, examining how the timber industry's profit-driven approach to forest management created the conditions for violence. The Great Eastern Lumber Company's treatment of the Trentham forest, its reduction of a 10,000-year-old ecosystem to board feet and dollar signs, exemplified the broader pattern of resource extraction that characterized the Gilded Age economy. The ecological analysis has examined the long-term consequences of the cutting, documenting how the destruction of old-growth forest created environmental damage that persisted for decades. The loss of soil, the warming of streams, the elimination of species that depended on old-growth conditions, all of these impacts were measurable for generations after the cutting, and some have never been fully reversed. The legal analysis has focused on the property rights framework that enabled the destruction. The court ruling that granted the timber company the right to cut the Trentham forest was based on a legal doctrine that treated timber rights as separable from land ownership, a doctrine that effectively allowed corporations to destroy the environmental foundation of communities without their consent. Legal scholars have cited the Trentham case as evidence of the need for environmental rights that go beyond traditional property law. Psychologists have examined the clan's response through the lens of collective trauma, noting that the destruction of the forest represented an attack on identity that went far beyond property loss. The Trenthams did not merely lose trees, they lost the physical manifestation of 5 generations of stewardship, the living library that contained their knowledge, the pharmacy that sustained their health, the cathedral that housed their spiritual lives. The campaign of vengeance can be understood as a response to existential threat, the violence of people whose entire world had been destroyed. You see, what the Trentham clan did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. They killed 22 men, each death connected to wood and timber in ways that sent an unmistakable message about why the victims were dying. The fact that those victims had participated in the destruction of a 10,000-year-old forest does not eliminate the fact that 22 human lives were taken in response to the loss of trees, however ancient and irreplaceable those trees may have been. And yet their story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that murder is wrong. They lost something that 5 generations had stewarded, and that 10,000 years of natural processes had created. The forest that was destroyed in 3 months of cutting had been developing since the last ice age, had contained trees older than any human civilization on the continent, had sheltered species and ecosystems that could not be replicated. Its destruction was an act of violence against the earth itself, perpetrated by men who saw in those ancient trees nothing but lumber. Their story challenges us to consider the relationship between human law and natural heritage, between property rights and environmental stewardship, between the generations who inherit the earth and the generations who destroy it for profit. The legal system treated the Trentham forest as a timber resource, assignable a dollar value subject to ownership claims and court rulings. The Trentham clan viewed it as something far more, as a living community that had taken 10,000 years to develop and that 3 months of cutting had destroyed forever. The question of proportionality haunts this story, as it haunts all such narratives. Trees cut, men killed. Can the loss of a forest, however ancient, justify the taking of human lives? The answer depends on what we believe forests are. If they are merely resources, the response was insane, the murder of 22 men for the loss of timber that would eventually grow back. If they are what the Trenthams believed them to be, living communities whose destruction represents an irreversible crime against the future, then the question becomes far more complex. The descendants of the Trentham clan still live on that land, beneath the slopes of Mount LeConte, still steward the second-growth forest that has replaced the old growth their ancestors knew. The forest is beautiful in its own right, tall and green and full of life, but it lacks the grandeur of what was destroyed, the massive trunks and the ancient canopy, and the understory complexity that only millennia of undisturbed growth can produce. The Trenthams know what was lost, because the knowledge has been passed down through generations. The memory of the original forest, preserved in stories and songs that describe a world that no living person has ever seen. The hills of the Great Smokies remain today among the most beautiful landscapes in America, protected now by the national park that the Trentham story helped inspire. The forests that cover them are largely second growth, the original old growth having been cut by the same industry that destroyed the Trentham Hollow, but they are recovering slowly, in the patient way that forests recover when given the time and the protection that their complexity requires. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Ezekiel stood, to see the graves where he and Sarah rest beneath trees their grandchildren planted, to walk the hollow where a cathedral of ancient forest once stood? Would you breathe the mountain air, feel the wind that has blown through these ridges for millennia, sense the presence of what has been lost? The journey is easier now than it was in the Trenthams' time. The roads improved by the national park that protects the surrounding land, but the final miles must still be covered on foot, following trails that the Trentham descendants maintain, paths that Ezekiel walked during the years of his campaign. The people who live in the surrounding hollows still know the Trentham story, still speak of Ezekiel and Sarah when strangers ask about the history of the region. They will point the way to the cemetery, will share their own memories or the memories their parents passed down, will help visitors understand the context that makes the story comprehensible. They do not judge the Trenthams for what they did, do not condemn them as murderers, see in their actions the response of a family who had watched the destruction of something that could never be replaced, and who chose to answer that destruction in the only language the destroyers could understand. The cemetery sits on a ridge above the hollow, sheltered by tulip poplars that are now over a century old, tall and stately but still children compared to the giants that once stood in their place. Ezekiel and Sarah rest together, their stones simple and unadorned, bearing only names and dates and the silence that the mountain provides. No inscription describes what they did or why. The stones speak only of lives lived and ended, of dust returned to dust on the ridge where the story began. Standing at those graves, looking out over the hollow where the forest is slowly reclaiming what was taken, one can almost hear the echo of falling trees, the crash that announced the end of a world and the beginning of a campaign that would claim 22 lives. The forest is beautiful today, green and growing, and full of the promise that time and patience will eventually produce something approaching what was lost. But it will take centuries more before these mountains again hold the kind of forest that Ezekiel knew, the kind that his great-great-grandfather Angus had found when he first followed the elk trail through Sugarland's Gap. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of the Trentham clan close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. Their story will continue to be told as long as people love forests and understand that some things cannot be measured in board feet, cannot be replaced by replanting, cannot be reduced to profit and loss statements in a Philadelphia office. They are gone now, the old man and his wife, dust mingling with the earth of the ridge where they lived and fought, and where they rest. But what happened between them and the forest they loved echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of the Trentham clan, who butchered 22 timber barons after they clear-cut 3,000 acres of the oldest forest in eastern America. Each man killed in circumstances involving wood and timber. Each death a message about the consequences of destroying something that 10,000 years of natural processes had created and 3 months of corporate greed had erased, the campaign continuing for 2 years until every man responsible had paid with his life. A story of love between people and forest, of devastating loss and patient fury, of justice found where the law would not provide it, and of a clan who proved that 5 generations of mountain stewardship will not accept the destruction of their world without a reckoning that the destroyers could never have imagined. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all.